This is Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of big old Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of the most impactful and celebrated presidents of the United States. Countries around the globe admired him. Under his big stick policy, the US rose to a major global power. He was also the first ever American to receive a Nobel Prize. And his daughter had placed a laurel wreath on the man who had supposedly won the marathon, but just as she reached for the gold medal to award him with, the crowd erupted in anger. Voices from the stands began to shout, "He has cheated." This is the Olympics marathon, and this is the 112-page Olympic Charter. But the story that I'm going to tell you is a little old. It was a time when this charter had not yet existed, and science had yet to prove many myths wrong. This remarkable true story has more twists than any novel I have read. The year is 1904, and the third ever Olympics are about to be held. The US is hosting the Games. The first ever modern Olympics were held in 1896 in Greece, and the event featured the marathon as a 25-mile endurance race. Although the race itself has a history of over 2,500 years, the Olympics made it a global sensation, especially in the US. Just a year later, after the first Olympics, the US started its own marathon-inspired sport event, called the Boston Marathon. Again, it instantly became a national sensation. So by the time the 1904 Olympics arrived in the US, the public was already obsessed with the marathon. But before the race begins, let me talk about this man, James Edward Sullivan. He believed that forced dehydration would result in performance gain in athletes. He really wanted to try out his theory. Luckily for him, he was the chief organizer for this very Olympic marathon. To test his theory out, he provided only one water station for the entire 25-mile course. He also chose an unpaved road choked with dust. On top of all, to really ensure maximum misery, he scheduled the race for a scorching August afternoon in St. Louis, a city widely known for having a hot, humid, and uncomfortable climate during the summer. The race begins. Sam Mellor, a well-known American athlete who won the Boston Marathon 2 years ago, takes the lead. Although he has surpassed every other 31 contestants, the dust, dehydration, and extreme heat take their toll, and he falls to the ground at about the 12-mile mark. John Lorden, another established American marathon runner who has been the victor of the previous year's Boston Marathon, faces the same fate as Sam Mellor, becoming violently ill. He starts vomiting and crashes to the ground. At about the 10-mile mark, he is also forced to quit. William Garcia, another American athlete, gets choked with dust and gravel, kicked by the race officials' cars. He is found unconscious, lying on the track. The spectators rush him to the hospital with severe internal injuries. He was constantly vomiting blood. If he had not been taken to the hospital in time, he would have died. He had fallen to the ground at about the 19-mile mark. Félix Carvajal was also one of the contestants. He was a Cuban mailman who had come all the way from Havana just to participate in the marathon. He was extremely poor. To participate in the competition, he went door to door, home to home, and collected donations in his hometown. After securing enough donations to cover the travel costs, he arrived in New Orleans. But there, he got distracted. He was left penniless, surrounded by entertainers, con artists, and women. With no other way to get to St. Louis, his only option was to walk. So he walked. He covered the distance of just under 700 miles on foot. Felix had lived his whole life in poverty, and he couldn't even afford another pair of clothes. So when he arrived at the venue, he was wearing whatever he had left his home with, normal streetwear, a white long-sleeve shirt and a pair of wool trousers. Because his clothing was entirely unsuitable for the hot, humid conditions, another competitor, often identified as American discus thrower Martin Sheridan, took pity on him and used scissors to cut Carvajal's trousers off at the knee to create shorts. Nonetheless, he starts the race, and halfway through, he sees some spectators eating peaches. He has not eaten in 2 days. In extreme hunger, he asks if he could have some fruit. As they refuse and ignore him, Felix snatches 2 peaches out of their hands and runs away. But these 2 peaches simply couldn't make up for his 2 days of hunger. After covering a little more distance, he passes through an apple orchard. He hastily picks 3 apples and eats them. Quite unfortunate for him, those apples were rotten. It was not choking dust or scorching heat and humidity. but severe food poisoning that forced him to stop. He didn't have any team or handlers that could direct him on what to do and what not to. He simply did what he thought was best. Because of those apples, he was suffering from severe stomach pain and diarrhea. In pain, he lies down and takes some rest. After a long nap and regaining some of his strength, he jumps back up and re-enters the race. Now, let's talk about the man Alice Roosevelt was about to award the gold medal, Frederick Lorz. But before we continue, if you're enjoying this chaotic trip through history, hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more wild stories like this one, make sure to subscribe. I have plenty of crazy tales coming your way soon. Now back to the story. So Lorz was actually a very competent runner who would go on to win the Boston Marathon the very next year. But under the brutal St. Louis sun, he struggled, and around the 9-mile mark, due to extreme exhaustion, he quit. His manager picked him up in the support car and took him to the stadium that was set up near the finish line. As they drove, Lorz didn't hide in the back seat in shame. Instead, he leaned out and waved to the exhausted runners and spectators as he cruised past them. But then, at the 19-mile mark, the support car, like everyone else, broke down too. In a moment of total confusion, or perhaps just as a joke, Lorz decided to jump out and re-enter the race. He ran for the final few miles and crossed the finish line. He looked so fresh and healthy that the crowd standing near the podium believed he had pulled off a miracle. Nonetheless, they cheered for him as he stepped up to the podium and celebrated his victory. Alice Roosevelt placed the wreath on him, but as she was about to award him the gold medal, the spectators who had seen Lorz waving from the car confronted him. They claimed he hadn't run the entire race, but had actually taken a ride in a car. The officials quickly came forward and confronted Lorz with these allegations. He, upon the confrontation, admitted that he had cheated and told everyone, the enraged spectators, furious officials, and confused Alice, that he was just playing a practical joke. Nonetheless, he was banned for life, but just after 6 months, the ban was lifted. Then who won the race? Well, it was this guy, Thomas Hicks, and his story is truly one of a kind. So, as you might have guessed, with the chief organizer's forced dehydration experiment, it was a time when a lot had to be tested and verified, and people believed all sorts of nonsense. His trainers believed that giving him strychnine, an extremely toxic rat poison, would enhance his performance. By the 18-mile mark, as Hicks began to show signs of serious exhaustion, they went ahead and gave him his first dose. Results? Well, he started crumbling, unable to maintain a mental connection with his legs. It was not because of the heat or dust, but the poison his trainers had given him. But the trainers thought otherwise and gave him yet another dose. At this point, Hicks collapsed on the ground. The doses he had received were enough to kill him. Nonetheless, his trainers really wanted him to finish the race, so they picked him up and literally dragged him miles towards the finish line. And thus, he was the first to cross the line, taking about 3 hours and 29 minutes. In those 3.5 hours, he lost a staggering 8 pounds. In the 1904 Olympic marathon, out of 32 runners, only 14 finished. That is a completion rate of roughly 44%, which remains the lowest in Olympic history to this day. For comparison, most modern marathons have a completion rate of over 95%. Even in the brutal heat of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, about 71% of the runners finished. Out of those 14, the Cuban mailman, Felix, also finished the marathon. He actually came fourth. The second position went to Albert Corey, and the third to Arthur Newton. Both were Americans. Had Felix not been starving, had not eaten those rotten apples and focused on the race instead of chatting with spectators, and if he'd actually been wearing athletic gear, he likely would have won the marathon with ease. I must also mention these two men. They were already in St. Louis for the South African exhibit at the World's Fair and decided to participate in the marathon. Out of poverty, they could not even afford pairs of shoes, so they ran the entire race barefoot. Just imagine, a scorching hot, unpaved course. And they still finished. Len Taunyan took 9th place and John Masciani took 12th. Because of the high number of near fatalities, officials strongly considered removing the marathon from future Olympics. However, instead of an outright ban, the disaster led to major improvements in safety protocols, including more frequent water stations, better medical oversight, and safer course conditions for the 1908 Olympics held in London. The myth of performance gain from purposeful dehydration was also busted, and assisting a runner over the finish line, as was done with Hicks, was made a disqualifying offense, but the actual villain got away without facing any charges. Anyways, that's all for now. See you at the next one. Take care. Bye. A ghost I haven't quite finished yet.